this is kind of a different presentation. I'm going to talk to you about keeping families safe from the troubled teen industry. First of all, who knows about the troubled teen industry? Got a couple, good deal. And I can't see online, so we'll just go with. I'll introduce myself first. I am a mom, first of all, and that kind of led me to all the rest of my roles. My oldest son, when he at 15 ended up on the streets after our experience in the troubled teen industry, I went back to school to try to figure out what the hell happened and what we were going to do, and became an occupational therapist, and basically just kept going to school until they wouldn't let me anymore. And so now I teach, and I am doing quite a bit of writing. So that's kind of who I am. No. No. Can you move it? It was working earlier. I'm pointing at you. Oh, there we go. Objectives. I'm wanting you to, at the end of this, describe the consequences to families pulled into TTI programs. Identify red flags for predatory practices, both for your own families and families that you serve, so you can differentiate sound treatment facilities from those that are potentially predatory. And I want to differentiate between authentic peer-to-peer supports and what is called peer-to-peer supports often in those programs, because they're very different. This is my son, and our experience started with my oldest son. Our experience started with I was a teenage mom in really hard circumstances, and we lived through a lot of trauma way back before anybody was talking about trauma. So we didn't recognize it or identify it. And frankly, I didn't think it was an issue because he wasn't the target of the violence that we lived in. Fast forward, he was hearing voices by kindergarten. He was being kicked out of nursery schools. And our family went through all kinds of counseling, all kinds of different, tried to figure out diets and everything else to try to figure out what was going on. At some point, a psychologist told me that the problem was that I was a single mom with a single kid and I needed to get married. So I did that, found a really neat guy, still married to him, that didn't fix it. By 5th grade, our solution was just to move from place to place. Got married, we built this beautiful house. That was going to fix it, didn't. And as Aaron moved toward adolescence, his mental illness expressed itself more and more. And by the time he was in the 5th grade, the school said, you just take him home, and if you won't tell, we won't tell. And I didn't know any better. I was a hairdresser, artist, doing my best. So I didn't know any better, took him home. We wrapped news around. He had a lot of learning disabilities. So school was pretty stressful for him, period. Took him home, wrapped newsprint around the living room, taught him how to write. We read wonderful literature. His day-to-day mental health was better than it was in school because the stressors were way different, but he was still experiencing a significant amount of psychosis. He was kind of a rapid cycler, so he would cycle pretty quickly. In the spring of that school year, he snuck out at night, we lived in a college town, went to a college party. He was a big kid, went to a college party, got drunk. The police found him passed out on railroad tracks. And they said, oh, he must be back in school. He cannot be out of school. So we said, okay, the school would only take him if I would bring him an hour late, pick him up for lunch, and then pick him up an hour early. And I didn't know better. I didn't know to argue any of that. I just did what I was told. So he was a rapid cycler. That worked about 3 weeks with lots of different kinds of issues. And the last day that he went to school, I had dropped him off in the morning and he was fine. He was my articulate, beautiful, brilliant little boy. By the time I picked him up at lunch, he was delusional, hallucinating. Somebody was coming to kill him and he needed to kill himself before they did, because it was better if he did it than they did it. I got him home. I wrapped my arms around him in my kitchen, said, you're safe. He had no idea I was even there. And I was court ordered to bring him back to school like that. So I called juvenile justice and said, this is a bad idea. This is not going to go well. And they said, well, you have to bring him to the community mental health center. We had managed, probably not to our benefit because we didn't know anything about public mental health. We had managed to kind of cobble together and pay for our own counseling and psychology and psychiatrists and all the stuff that we did. So they didn't know us and we didn't know them. So I showed up at 3:15 when they could see him. And by that time, he had cycled back out of it. He was articulate and brilliant and beautiful. And I was a basket case. So I brought him, and the intake person took him back and talked with him and came back and said, he is delightful. You just need to calm down. And I had the thought, because I hadn't slept in years, really. I had the thought, maybe it's me. Maybe I really am the one that is not perceiving reality. So we got to his counselor at the end of his work day, and I walked in and said, one of us is really sick, and I don't know who. You just need to figure it out and help us. And he said, Erin needs to go into the hospital. So we had our first hospitalization, which lasted about 3 weeks, and they managed to exhaust the entirety of his mental health benefit for his life. And then told us that we needed long-term care and that he needed, the first place they referred us to was the Brown schools, which cost about 7 times what my husband and my annual income was every year. So that wasn't going to work. And I called and begged them. That was not going anywhere. And our other option, they sent us to the state hospital, but the state hospital really didn't do long-term. Their suggestion was you need to relinquish him. That's how you're going to get support from him, is to relinquish. This was in the age before internet, so it was hard to do a lot of research, but I did some, and their outcomes really didn't seem very good. And so that didn't seem like a good idea. So I called a psychiatrist. I had stalked, I don't know how many different psychiatrists across the country, for years. And so one of those psychiatrists that I stalked from Colorado, who had some decent outcomes, I called and said, here we are, I don't know what to do, help. And he said, well, I've heard about this place in North Texas that we lived in Central Texas. I heard about this place in North Texas that if you bring him up there and move up there, you can take in other kids and he can go to treatment in the daytime and then come home at night. And I thought, yeah. So I called a mama whose kid was in there, who had drunk the Kool-Aid. We all did. And she said it was wonderful. Her kid was doing great. We sold everything we owned, to include that big fancy house, my husband's drum set, his Aggie boots, everything we could sell, and moved ourselves up there and opened up a host home. We took in 183 kids that year, but Aaron never came home. He was horrifically abused through that year. Broken arm, hernia from restraints. He was restrained every day, repeatedly. He had severe mental illness they were really behavioral. They had no clue and no skill set. And so the solution was to try their which resulted in severe trauma. So about 10 months later, they kicked him out. So we had a kid with severe mental illness and severe trauma. Didn't know trauma. This is still before the ACEs study. This was in the early 90s. Didn't know trauma. Could not find a therapist or anybody who would see him because they didn't know what to do. And so they didn't want to waste our time and money. He really wanted friends and people to connect to, but it was really hard for him to connect to other people given his experience. So he's really started connecting with the kids who had also been in straight, many of whom have lived on the streets. So they started running away, and then we pushed for juvenile justice because we didn't know what else to do. And that was also a really bad idea. And our experience was that Aaron learned how to live on the streets. He learned how to hop trains. He would get on a train, go to whatever city it stopped at, stay there about 2 weeks till the paranoia would escalate, get on another train and go to another city. And he grew up like that. That was his adolescence from 25 really through his adulthood until he got to the point where physically he could not hop trains. Our outcomes in terms of our experience with the troubled teen industry. And I'll do it again. So briefly, a history of the troubled teen industry to the present is largely unregulated. So the number of children and families that are tangled in it are unknown. The American Bar Association estimates between 120,000 and 200,000 kids are in some kind of residential treatment, boot camp or correctional facility, but that doesn't really account for how many of those are troubled teen industry facilities or other facilities. The troubled teen industry began with an organization called Synanon, which was originally a recovery community that became kind of a dark cult of personality. SEED was a federally funded therapeutic community based on Synanon. And they used attack therapy called encounter therapy back then. And staff, quote unquote, who had basically come up through the program. And so what they knew was encounter or attack therapy. That was their version of treatment. They had been enculturated in that kind of confrontational style AA because it was built based on 12 steps, except for not, my kids called it Nazi AA. That also became the base for the original troubled teen industries, which were SEED, Straight, which is where we were, Elon, Daytop, and the WWAS programs. And then the Straight Legacy program. So after it, Aaron was released in 91, right before the state of Texas chased them out. We didn't know that. Probably released Aaron because they didn't want him to talk to anybody. But we didn't know that, but they eventually closed their doors in 93. However, then there was this whole kind of spate of legacy programs. So all the kids programs, and they were like kids of El Paso, kids of North Jersey, kids of whatever. Those are straight legacy programs. The Pathway Family Center, Life, Growing Together, SAFE, Alberta Adolescent Recovery Center, and there's a whole bunch of them in Utah. The Turnabout, Lifeline, Stillwater Academy. It's really kind of like whack-a-mole. So when one closes, that staff tends to kind of move somewhere else and either recreate one or go to work for another one. They might call themselves wilderness therapy or adventure therapy or boot camps or schools or academies. They use all kinds of different names. So how do you tell? Red flags to look for. So characteristics, Chatfield, and I've got a bunch of resources on the resource page that have a bunch of books and different things that you can look into further. Chatfield, himself a survivor, uses the term totalistic to describe the culture and practices of TTIs. And he has 7 features. One, there's a strict system of peer policing. And this is not peer-to-peer like we think of in the family and mental health world as peer-to-peer. This is a very abusive, controlling kind of peer-to-peer. A strict system of peer policing, very controlled communications. So Aaron never was able to speak with us without somebody controlling, somebody monitoring his speech so that he could not tell us what was happening. 3, there's a central kind of all powerful authority structure. 4, they're required status change levels. So they work on a level system. Straight had 5 levels, although there were a couple in between there that were kind of transitional. So it was really a little more than that. But you have to, at each level, you have different privileges. 5, mandatory confession and confrontation. So therapy in straight was, imagine a room 3 times as large as this room with chairs that were not spaced, that were close to each other. There were those blue plastic kind of chairs, and the kids were in rows and rows and rows, and they were required to stand up and confront each other and confess. And if you didn't confess, you got restrained or you were challenged on all kinds of things that were true or not true. They have very inflexible rules and punishments. And their philosophy is one of total transformation. So the idea is that you have to break down in order to build up. So you have to be totally transformed, meaning that you have to lose your old self in order. So straight and cultured families, enculturated families in tough love. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with tough love. It was a very popular kind of, I hate to call it family to family support, but it really kind of was, but using a very absolute kind of ideology. Kids have to experience their consequences, and you just have to toughen it up. So the idea that our children had to hit their bottom and experience their consequences to be motivated for change was central, which is what made me keep Aaron there. Even when I would think I was going to quit, that, you know what, this is not working. It's like, you can't quit before the miracle. You know, he's got to go through this. And if you quit now, you're going to quit before he gets healed, before he gets well. And it also goes with that old kind of medical model that somehow or another we're going to fix something. So the problem is that heavy-handed kind of behavioral modification really doesn't, if it works for anybody, it really doesn't work for kids that really have severe mental illness. And the level of ignorance that we all had at that point really wasn't very helpful either. So things to ask: do they have a treatment philosophy? What is that? Is it cognitive behavioral therapy? Is it, what? And then do their practices match their theory? If they can articulate a theory to you, how do they interact? How do they enact that? How is that happening? If they state behavioral modification or personal transformation, run like hell. It's not good. So those are two kind of keys that you want to leave. Next thing to look at is, who are their staff? Are they licensed? And then, are the therapeutic activities led by therapists or who? So remember, we talked about Straits, this big room full of chairs. If they had a professional there, it was maybe a KDAC, but it was somebody who had come up through the program and then been hired. And so they were really enculturated into that encounter style confrontation. And again, it's like whack-a-mole, they show up everywhere. So Google them, look for who their staff are and Google them and see, are there other allegations of abuse? I've given you a couple of resources there, info@endthettti.org, or a bunch of survivors. And if you're concerned about any particular place, if you will send that to them, they will do the work to kind of find out what they can find out about them. Because they have a whole network kind of looking and trying to protect kids and families. So that is a good resource for you. And then lastly, are children allowed to speak to their families freely? Because if they're not, that is problematic. Can you call your child whenever you want? Can you talk to them without a chaperone, monitoring what they say to you? Ah, there we go. I went one too far. There we go. So instead, we need to be well-grounded. Instead, we need to think about what are the characteristics of authentic peer-to-peer supports. They are not coercive. They are, in adult systems, they adhere to recovery principles, which are that they are supportive, they engender hope. Often they use harm reduction, which is the polar opposite of tough love. Do they know and adhere to wraparound principles? Care is individualized, it's strength-based, culturally competent, family-driven, youth-guided, team-based, persistent. These are all of the principles that probably you all know from wraparound. And outcome-based. Is there a plan to go back to community that incorporates the principles of wraparound, which really I think of as an overarching kind of framework for kids and families? Building bridges, and I haven't been involved with them recently, but Building Bridges was an initiative that was looking at kind of that transition back to community from care and helping residential treatment facilities become better. Next, so Martin Rafferty with youth, now with Youth Era, but back when he was a youth, about 15 years ago, it was the last conference that was up in Portland, last family conference that was up in Portland. He took the youth and they spent their time developing a youth bill of rights for youth in residential treatment. And it's a living document, so it changes. So I've given you the link there rather than the rights, but he has, right now there are 4 rights. First one is that youth have the right to be fully informed in youth-friendly language about what their treatment is about, what kind of potential side effects or damage that can occur from it, and what alternatives there are. So what are the other things that they could choose from? 2, they have the right to directly evaluate the facility that they're in and to report any concerns that they have. 3, they have the right to the least restrictive transitions. And 4, all professionals should be trained in positive youth development, and they have the right to work with professionals who understand strengths. So contrast that with tough love. It's really about building up rather than breaking down at its core. So we're going to contrast really quickly and recap those. So on the left are sound practices, on the right are TTI. So a sound practice is to use family-driven ideology and to really embed the wraparound principles. I teach my students that is our overarching kind of frame, and it's how we hold ourselves responsible for best practice. If I'm not living those principles, then I'm not doing so. I need to make a change somewhere. Versus in TTIs, it is very authoritarian, a whole lot of shaming, a whole lot of confronting and yelling, tough love. Second, in responsible treatment, it is peer guided. There are supports that are driven by youth versus an authentic peer-to-peer supports versus peers as enforcers. Very different, although you will sometimes hear it referred to as positive peer pressure. It is anything but positive. And then third, do they have, again, licensed professional staff? Who is facilitating their group? So I have worked in acute psych, homeless centers, schools, and family-run organization. Good hospitals have licensed professionals leading their groups. They're not techs. They're not kind of people with no training that they just brought in at minimum wage and threw in there. Who is running their groups, and how much time do kids actually spend with licensed professionals? And do they get one-on-one kind of sessions? Because really, TTI is driven by profit, and they don't hire staff, or they don't hire staff that they have to pay. So are they fluent in positive youth development and strength-based practices? And in TTI, they're going to have very limited contact with professionals and very few people with licenses. Are they trauma-informed? Versus in TTIs, you'll see mandatory confession, inflexible rules, and a lot of punitive kind of responses, a lot of restraint, many deaths and injuries. Treatment techniques in responsible places are reputable, so they're evidence-based. They could be cognitive behavioral, dialectical behavioral, acceptance and commitment therapy. They can explain to you what the theory is that they're working from and what that looks like in practice. Versus behavioral mod, which is frankly the lowest common denominator. It's the easiest thing to kind of figure out. And that idea of personal transformation. And then lastly, open contact versus youth being monitored when they talk to anybody on the outside. So instead, let's talk about the importance of access to effective supports in the least restrictive environment. Home with family is best, and we need to direct those resources into community and into family supports in community. Erin really needed for us to have access to a family advocate, someone who knew wraparound because it existed, someone who knew IDEA and how to argue for the supports that he needed in school. He had none. And who could have helped us build kind of effective supports around him to help him function at home. We don't need more resource officers and more hardening of schools. We need stronger school mental health supports, preferably starting with whole school, social and emotional learning, restorative justice, supports for school success. We don't need tough love. we need to look deeply at what kids need and figure out how to respond to those needs. And in our justice systems, we don't need, who knows, and the Andy Griffith Show. I may just be too old. So we don't need more Barney Fives. And I'm afraid all we hire are Barney Fives. If they want to hire more police officers, then give me Andy Griffiths. Tell me how you're going to create police officers that are not going to abuse people. And until I hear that, don't talk to me about it. So, and then because we know family and youth need to be driving us to that point where we're giving all the supports in community. Thank you for letting me share with you. This is Aaron's website. So he started, I lost him 5 years ago to overdose. He started about 10 years before his death, writing a book that we were supposed to write together, his voice, so youth and adult voice, and then my voice, and then evidence-based practice. I dragged my feet. He had written a lot. I started when he died, transcribing that and writing my parts. It's now finally finished, although I keep adding to it, but it's out for editing right now. But in the meantime, because it took me so long, I started this website, and it has all three layers. So it has a lot of Aaron's poetry, and then it has a blog, my voice, and then it has a whole resources section that has some great resources if you want to share them. The next thing I owe it is some work on restorative justice. I've got a few chapters I'm writing in some textbooks. Speaking of which, anybody who is interested in talking to me about, I'm an occupational therapist, and I'm always recruiting with occupational therapists. I've always been a mental health OT, and I'm always recruiting in OTs that we go back to our roots, which are in mental health, because we are kind of the original activity kind of therapists that use doing. And I have been tagged to write the chapter on family involvement, yay, in our really kind of premier mental health text with another lady who is also a parent in Australia. I'm really excited because they do some cool mental health stuff. But I'm going to challenge everyone, anybody who wants to tag me and tell me anything that you want therapists to consider with families, I have an in. So come bend my ear, because I would love to hear anything that I have my own ideas, but you may have totally different ideas than I do, and I would love to hear them. So that's who I am, and thank you, and I'm sorry I've gone into your snack time.